Hey guys, I'm Peter.
I'm Shannon.
And welcome to the Decryption Podcast.
So in today's episode, we're going to be telling you the truth about what actually happened on 9/11. So for today's video, I'm going to be referencing the movie 9/11, An Anatomy of a Great Deception. The host of this movie is Dave Hooper, and I'm going to be posting the link in the description. You'll be able to find this movie on Twitter and Rumble. So the first person I want to look at in today's video is actually George Bush. The question that I have about George Bush is why did he stay in the school for 30 minutes after learning about the second tower being hit? The number of planes, the number of targets were still unknown at this point. Clearly, once the second plane hit the second tower, it was obvious that we were under a terrorist attack. But with that being said, we didn't know how many total planes had been hijacked. We didn't know how many total number of targets that there were. Another thing that we do know is that on September 7th, 4 days before 9/11, George Bush actually made it public information that he was going to be visiting the school. But it's not like a regular school is going to have great protection. Don't get me wrong, the Secret Service is going to be there, but it would not be considered safe under a terrorist attack. So the fact that he stayed for an extra 30 minutes after learning that the second tower had fell means that someone in his circle must have felt or known that they were going to be safe. But how could anybody actually know that?
Another thing is that the people who challenged the theory of it being melted by the jet fuel, they weren't even just regular conspiracy theorists or people that you would say had a tinfoil hat. They were actual engineers, people in aviation, civil defense, architecture, science, government, and even in the military. I mean, these are people that are actually studying or have studied in the past, have gotten degrees, and are very well educated in those fields, and even they are challenging what is being released about 9/11.
There were also more events on 9/11 than just the Twin Towers falling. So here's a rundown of the official story in chronological order.
4 planes were hijacked by 19 mostly Saudi Arabian terrorists.
The 4 planes that were hijacked were attempted to fly into 4 United States buildings. World Trade Center 1, also known as the North Tower, World Trade Center 2, also known as the South Tower, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Capitol.
3 attacks were successful. World Trade Center 1 at 8:46, World Trade Center 2 at 9:03, and the Pentagon at 9:37.
At 9:59, the South Tower collapsed. It collapsed in less than an hour after it had been hit.
At 10:07 a.m., a flight crashes in a field in Pennsylvania. At 10:28 a.m., World Trade Center 1 collapses. And then at 5:20, World Trade Center 7 also collapsed, which a lot of people do not know about this one.
NIST, which stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, backed up the official government version that fires caused all 3 buildings of steel to weaken and fail. This includes Building 7, which was not hit by an airplane. It also wasn't exposed to jet fuel, which is what supposedly made the Twin Towers cave in and collapse.
Shyam Sundar of NIST also stated that, quote, the buildings were not brought down by explosives. And before he said this, nobody knew bombs were even in consideration. They said this before there were any questions. It's kind of like a toddler trying to avoid guilt.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
Another thing that doesn't make sense to me is that the families of the 9/11 victims actually wanted the government to open up a federal investigation into what actually happened. With all due respect, why would the families be the ones wanting an investigation to be opened up? You would assume these families would be seeking peace and closure.
Our perception of what happened on September 11th is very different from the general public's perception, I'd say, for the most part.
I believe that the public is still uninformed about most of the issues that are surrounding them.
I just don't think the public at all knows. They want to believe.
I think the truth sometimes can be frightening.
There's some deep explaining to do.
The bottom line is that it needs to be investigated.
We have to demand a new investigation. I want justice here.
Nobody ever stopped to have a scientific investigation.
So, do these families know something that we don't? And if so, what is it?
World Trade Center 7 was built in 1984, and because of this, it had a lot of modern-day advancements in building technology. It was a 47-story, steel-framed, fireproof skyscraper standing 550 feet tall. It was 300 feet away from World Trade Center 1, which, by the way, is roughly the size of a football field. It also would have been the largest building in 33 states at the time.
At 5:20 p.m. on the day of 9/11, Building 7 collapsed. Again, even though World Trade Center 7 was never hit by a plane, the official explanation for all three of the towers falling down was that the fires weakened the steel, and that's what led to the collapse.
According to a poll, 43% of Americans have never even heard of World Trade Center 7. Building 7, matter of fact, housed the CIA's largest station outside of DC, believe it or not. It also contained the Secret Service's biggest field offices. The IRS, the Department of Defense, and the SEC also occupied entire floors each in that building, believe it or not.
The New York City mayor's management bunker was also underneath Building 7, but ironically, they didn't use it that day. And then the top 17 floors were actually all occupied by banks. These banks were Salomon Smith Barney, FHL Banks, ITT Hartford, and the NAIC. The NAIC stands for National Association of Insurance Commissioners. There are also a couple other banks.
There was also paperwork from several active lawsuits against Wall Street banks being held there. But after the collapse of the tower, all those lawsuits were put to rest. Isn't that interesting?
So my question is, a building that is that important has that much stuff inside of it. How does it just collapse? Especially considering there's not a single explosion. So now let's shift our attention to the history of high-rise building fires. According to a 2011 report by the National Fire Protection Association, there's an average of 110 fires each year in buildings that are over 13 stories tall. According to the report, between 2005 and 2009, there were 550 high-rise fires.
In 1974 in São Paulo, Brazil, the Joma building caught fire due to an electrical spark. It burned twice as long as the Twin Towers building, and yet the underlying structure wasn't even weakened, and the building is still in use today.
The MGM Grand, which is located in Las Vegas, Nevada, caught on fire in 1980, killing 85 people. The structure underneath never failed though. The building is still in use today.
And then in 1988 in Los Angeles, the first Interstate Bank building burned for 3 hours. Again, with no structural damage to it whatsoever. And it is still in use today.
Then in 2004, the Park Central building, which is in Venezuela, is actually the country's tallest building. It was on fire for 17 hours, but the building is still in use today.
And then in 1991, the Meridian Plaza in Philadelphia burned for 18 hours straight, and it stood. And then in 2009 in Beijing, China, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel burned for 6 hours, and it stood.
And then in April of 2013, Chechnya's tallest building burned for 7 hours. It stood. Dubai, Moscow, Zurich, and many more countries have similar experiences. All their buildings stood. Fires don't melt steel or cause buildings to collapse.
And did you know that 9/11 was not the first time the World Trade Center was on fire? On February 13th, 1975, the 9th and 13th floor burned for 3 hours. No damage or weakening to the structure was recorded, which once again is wild.
The World Trade Center has itself burned many times with no structural failure or weakening. Some significant dates include February 13, 1975, when the 9th to the 14th floors burned for 3 hours. No damage or weakening of the structure was recorded.
The fire began in an electrical wiring closet on the 11th floor. Some fire department officials and building officials here say that there's no chance the World Trade Center could become a type of towering inferno.
And what's even more wild is that in 1993, the World Trade Center survived a bomb detonated in a highly vulnerable area with no structural damage caused by the fires that resulted from the explosion. There was damage from the bomb, but the structure was completely fine.
Watch how buildings fall during a controlled demolition. And what's the most common way to take a building down during a controlled demolition? It's with explosives.
Now, when buildings collapse due to a structural failure, the building will stay intact as it falls. It'll fall left or right. Think of like a giant domino getting pushed over. The Twin Towers did not fall like this. But the official story says the building collapsed due to structural failure.
There were only 3 times a fire has taken down a steel-framed high-rise building in all of history. And all 3 of them happened on 9/11.
Now for all my engineers out there, you know that building code requires that a lot of the necessary materials, they need to be fire resistant.
The NIST said the fires reached temperatures of 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. That is almost 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit colder than what is needed to melt steel.
There are also multiple engineers and firefighters who claim, quote, no steel building has ever been destroyed by fire, end quote. And what really doesn't make sense about that is how, again, they fell under their own footprint.
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire.
Collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
But there's a problem. Office and open-air jet fuel fires cannot melt steel.
A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology said that the maximum air temperatures was about 1,800 degrees or 1,000 degrees colder than what's needed to melt steel.
And it takes a blast furnace with air blowing with blowers to try to get steel to melt.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
This would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires, and I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
And seeing black smoke come out the windows, that means that the fires were oxygen-starved.
Kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material.
None of which would have been, in my experience as a fire protection engineer, hot enough to sufficiently soften the steel or damage the steel to result in a total collapse of the building.
Well, we're told that the planes hit the buildings and there was an explosion and a fire, and about an hour and a half later, in the case of the North Tower, the buildings collapsed due to structural weakening due to the fires. Fires in high-rises have never brought down a steel frame high-rise building at all, ever.
The bottom line is this. Steel-framed high-rises don't collapse, especially into their own footprint, because of fire. This is why builders and architects have loved steel for 100 years. A fire typically can't compromise the steel structure.
But remember, 9/11 wasn't just a regular fire. There was jet fuel, which means kerosene was involved. But that doesn't explain it. Only 2 out of the 3 buildings were exposed to kerosene. Now think of a kerosene lamp or a kerosene heater. In the history of kerosene lamps and heaters, you have never heard of one melting because the fires were too hot.
The Twin Towers were also starved of oxygen. That's why there's so much smoke coming out of all the buildings. But somehow they still found molten iron in the rubble of all 3 buildings. So something else was needed to provide the heat and energy necessary to liquefy, melt, or even microscopically bend the steel.
Outside of the NIST, scientists agreed that jet fuel nor the furnishings inside the building could heat the steel enough to melt it. Something else needs to be in play, especially when it comes to World Trade Center Building 7.
There's also been multiple times in history that planes have been reported to fly into high-rise buildings. However, none of them have ever been reported to fall. Granted, none of these buildings were hit with airplanes the same size as 9/11s, but this still does not explain Building 7.
If you throw a flaming chunk of metal onto a metal building, do you think the whole building's going to just collapse a few hours later? I mean, I don't think so.
That's what they're trying to make us believe with Building 7. That flaming pieces of metal just flew off the Twin Towers, landed on Building 7, and then the whole thing collapses. If the steel beams are actually bending and the structure really did fail, then why were all 3 buildings a symmetrical fall? A symmetrical fall means the building literally falls straight down in the same place. It doesn't bend at all. It comes straight down in its own footprint. So, did all 4 sides of the building melt at the exact same rate? And even if that did happen, did that happen for all 3 buildings? Do you realize the probability of that happening is less likely than 0.01%? Now, factor in that they all fell at a free fall speed. What I mean by that is there was no resistance as it fell. It just fell from the second that the top floor fell. The whole thing came down within 10 seconds. That does not just happen, except for, again, if you look at videos of a controlled demolition.
According to the NIST, the failure occurred on column 79 on level 12. They are claiming the failure of one column is responsible for the failure of the entire building.
Now, engineers will tell you, one break in the building, regardless of the location, will not result in a symmetrical free fall speed collapse. That is just simply not how steel buildings work.
The building would want to lean and topple over the area that was damaged if it became that critical. For a building to fall symmetrically, the damage also has to be symmetrical. So, asymmetrical damage in that case would also lead to an asymmetrical collapse. But in the case of 9/11, there happens to be an asymmetrical damage from the plane, but a symmetrical collapse from the building. So that doesn't really make sense.
When it comes to steel buildings, this just simply defies physics. If you took a billiard ball, which a lot of people know as the ball you use when you're playing pool, the table game, if you took that ball, the pool ball, and you dropped it from the top of the Twin Towers, and you started from the very top level, and you dropped it floor by floor, right? And on every floor it hit and it dropped. It hit and it dropped. It hit and it dropped. It would take over 1.5 minutes for that ball to reach the ground. The buildings were down in 10 seconds.
So when a building falls, the floor underneath it will kind of act as a brace. So take this, it falls, right? And then it falls, and then it falls, and it falls, and then it falls. It's not just gonna, it's not just gonna fall that quickly. So therefore, how did these buildings just collapse at a free fall speed? I mean, they weren't going and then increasing as the weight increased, right? Because obviously, as more collapses, it's going to be faster.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you never seen the beginning start slowly. It just.
That makes no sense. The columns in the middle of the building were also said to be strong enough to support multiple fallen floors above it, but they crumbled instantly instead. There would have had to have been a stronger force than just the top floor collapsing.
It just didn't add up the way the whole thing sort of pile drove itself into the ground and all at near free fall speed.
Collapses straight down into its own footprint at free fall speed. This is uncanny. There's 40,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist this collapse.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
The animation sequence from the National Institute of Standards and Technology for their model, their mathematical model of the collapse of building number 7. And they have the inside members, that one column gave way, which they claim resulted in the collapse of all the surrounding members, and then this precipitated a global collapse. This would just not be physically possible for a gravitational collapse.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense. Regardless of the engineering, the logic tells you that if you have a single failure at some random point in the building, that the entire building is not going to collapse. Buildings don't break that way.
The story that just a few columns can cause a synchronized global collapse, an implosion, is, well, that's just nonsense.
The exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
The building would want to topple over. It would want to bend over that weakened area and topple over sideways. What we saw the structures came straight down upon itself.
It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
At free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
If you took a billiard ball and dropped at the height of the Twin Towers and you just merely stopped it and started at every floor in free fall, it would take over 1.5 minutes to reach the ground. The buildings were down in 10 seconds.
Buildings just don't behave like that. If floors fall, they tend to fall and are braced by the floor directly beneath it. And there's some delay there. And then the next floor falls with 2 floors, and there's some more delay.
The buildings actually accelerated as they came down, meaning they were not getting resistance from these massive columns in the center of the core of this building. And when it's all finished, the outside walls from the lower floors are piled one on top of the other right in the middle of the building.
So it's fiction to say that a building as modern as World Trade Center 7 comes down with no resistance.
Doesn't add up.
The official explanation was dead wrong.
Just not possible.
Not possible. Just doesn't make sense. It's not how it works.
It can't happen.
Never before in history.
It just can't happen. Well, that's just nonsense.
And that cannot happen.
Couldn't happen. It's fiction.
There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
This was a controlled event.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
In short, the evidence is clear. We are witnessing not the collapse of a building, but its demolition.
Now let's talk about the molten iron and steel that was found. There were actually pools of molten iron found at the bottom of the rubble. It was estimated to even weigh tons.
So keep in mind that it was a mix of the fires in the offices and the jet fuel that brought this building down. But even then, jet fuel doesn't bring the fire up to the temperature necessary to melt iron, which would be 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature of the fire was roughly 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit at its peak.
And what we find down there is pools of molten iron.
What does that mean?
Several tons. Exactly. What is that doing there? The first responders see it. The structural engineers see it. It's documented by FEMA, the melting of steel. Normal office fires is what's supposed to have brought these buildings down, along with jet plane impacts. But jet fuel and office fires don't produce molten iron or molten steel. It doesn't begin to melt until 3,000 degrees.
At one point, I think there were about 2,800 degrees.
See the stuff he's pulling out? Yeah. It's red hot.
8 weeks later, we still got fires burning.
Now, molten iron can be an indication of the use of thermite. Now get this, thermite, thermate, and nanothermite are super hot burning substances that are used by the United States military that can cut through steel. It can also supply its own oxygen, so it can burn underwater.
Also, did you know that the fire burned at Ground Zero for 3 months after the crash? And the fires weren't fully put out until December 13th, 2001.
These fires would burn for 92 days, making it the longest building fire in world history.
So thermite would also explain potentially the fact that the fires could not be put out at Ground Zero. The fires lasted for quite a while.
Now you might be asking yourself, how is a fire going to burn for 92 days after the building has collapsed? Especially considering it's New York City. It's one of the biggest cities in all of America.
And we've never heard of this. Like, me personally, I've never heard of that. When in school did they even tell us about that?
I was never informed about that in school either. Well, the reason it was able to last for 92 days was because for much of this time, the building was actually burning underwater. This is only possible if there was thermite in play, and that is because only thermite is able to provide its own oxygen.
The NIST claimed that there were no explosives at play, and when asked if they ever looked, their answer was, quote, "We did not test for evidence of explosives."
So my question is, why was evidence for explosives never even tested, considering how absolutely bizarre the story was and how much didn't add up? Thermite was clearly the only logical explanation for the building collapse. The symmetrical fall, the free fall speed when collapsing, the beams being liquefied, the fire lasting for 3 months, and even lasting underwater. It should have been so obvious as to investigate these bombs. They literally didn't even consider it at any points in the investigation. Not even once did they think, let me test for bombs. Never, not even one time. That's crazy. It's almost as if they knew they would find evidence there were bombs. I mean, here we are 22 years later, and we have found the evidence. There clearly were bombs.
Isn't that crazy? It's one great cover-up.
Great cover-up.
They claimed that they ruled out explosives due to the fact that the size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses. The thing is, though, that they swept aside actual footage and evidence of people claiming that there were explosives, real witnesses saying that there are explosives going off.
There are multiple firefighters who claimed on video that they were hearing secondary explosions.
It's time to take a closer look at NIST. They are the scientific agency backing the official version of events as most Americans know them. I was hoping they would curb my growing anxiety. Instead, what I learned about NIST made my heart sink. To understand NIST, you need to understand the relationship to explosives. They have vehemently denied that there were any. Not only do they not check for them, they state that none were used. Plain and simple. In fact, they have gone to unbelievable lengths to prove that explosives, or even the evidence of explosives, like pops going off, did not exist. Some people might call it incompetence. Others might call it selling your soul.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
So the preconceived notion of NIST is that there's no evidence for explosives, and so there's no point in looking. That is the most unscientific thing that you can possibly think of, not to look because you don't expect to find evidence, and in fact the evidence is overwhelming.
NIST computed what they claimed would be the minimum loudness of an explosion that could sever column 79 with a single blast. Then they claimed no observers detected explosions as loud as their predictions.
This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
On the basis of this artificial threshold of interest, they swept aside all evidence of actual explosions and concluded that no explosives contributed to the destruction of the building.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse.
Is that a secondary explosion? Yes, it was.
That was the
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
Now, there are two types of explosions. There's primary explosions, and there are secondary explosions.
Alright, so the difference is primary explosions are what you hear during the first impact. So whenever the plane hit the tower. And then secondary explosions are what you hear after that. So let's say the first event has already occurred. So you're sitting here like, wait a minute, it can't be that because that already happened. So secondary explosions.
The firefighters were hearing secondary explosions. Ironically, these explosions are actually routine in a controlled demolition. One witness claims, quote, "It was like gunfire, and then there were 3 loud explosions," end quote. So how was someone able to hear 3 loud explosions? Now keep in mind, the second tower was hit 30 minutes after the first tower was hit. How would someone hear 3 loud explosions in that in-between time?
Like, it sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
That sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to.
You heard explosions, like boom.
We just heard one more explosion. That's about the 4th one we've heard.
CNN is now reporting that there was a 3rd explosion at the World Trade Center.
Equally unempirical is the treatment by NIST and Poppin Mechanics of reports of explosions before and during the collapses. Both documents pretend that there were no explosions.
Secondary explosion. We've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion.
Again, how could the government rule out the explosions due to the lack of evidence when we have all the evidence at our fingertips? The NIST also claims that there was no evidence of molten steel when there was clearly multiple videos of eyewitness reports telling you that there was a lot of molten steel there indeed.
Did you know that 2 weeks after 9/11, one of the cleanup teams actually had to stop for the day because they dug into a pocket of active molten steel? There's also a video of metal literally pouring out of the tower before it collapsed.
So their preferred method of dealing with this problem was to ignore or even deny the reports. John Gross, one of the chief authors of the NIST report, was captured on film while he was making a public presentation, saying that he knew of absolutely no eyewitness who has said there was a pool of molten steel.
I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the towers.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so.
Get down below and you see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
The fires got very intense down there and it actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of the wall from Building 6.
The premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it. I was on the site, I was on the steel yards, so I don't know that that's so.
Then I was at the site 2 weeks after it happened with Governor Pataki, right? And they had to cease digging that day. You know why? They were finding pockets of molten liquid metal.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron in the microspheres, in the rubble pile, and the metal pouring out of the side of the tower.
About 7 minutes before its final destruction, almost an hour after the plane hit, molten metal was seen coming out of the northeast corner near the 80th floor.
What was going on here? These guys at NIST are the official version. Office and jet fuel fires can reach about 1,600 degrees under ideal conditions, but NIST said that the fires burned at 1,800 degrees, which they claim was just enough to weaken and bend the steel, which led to complete failure of each building's infrastructure. But that still leaves us more than 1,000 degrees short of molten metal, which was found all over Ground Zero. They denied that molten metal existed, and they denied that witnesses heard secondary explosions going off. Even the NIST computer animation of Building 7's collapse is inaccurate, showing the outer structural walls crumpling in instead of coming straight down.
The NIST report, on which popular mechanics and much of the press has relied, is not a scientific report. It is a political document.
We need to have an investigation of NIST themselves. I believe that the reports that came out are not true.
So the fact that NIST says that is absolutely, in my opinion, it's criminal.
NIST wasn't looking for the truth. They were trying to hide it. But why? Were they asked to falsify their findings? I didn't think they came up with this on their own. When I see John Gross fidget and blush as he states there was no molten metal, I see a man that is doing what many of us do when we don't tell the truth. It's basic human nature.
So you can tell that we are clearly being lied to, and to this day, we haven't done anything about it. Nothing has been done about it, actually. And there's all these videos, so clearly the government is aware of it. But why wouldn't they launch an investigation?
Now, another thing that's really crazy to me is that the NIST actually has a computer model that shows them how the collapse should have looked. However, this was labeled inaccurate. The computer model for the NIST showed an asymmetrical collapse. Like we said earlier, that is because the damage done to the Twin Towers was asymmetrical. There was one side of the building was penetrated. Therefore, the whole building should not symmetrically fall.
And before we head off on this episode, we want to leave you guys with a couple of facts about the Twin Towers so that you guys can ponder and think about it a little bit. So, number one being is that the Twin Towers were what engineers would call a tube structure, which a tube structure is a very strong mesh of steel.
One of the building managers actually said that the Twin Towers were designed to have, quote, a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time, end quote. The same building manager who said this also said, quote, the building could probably sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because the structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door. The jet plane is just a pencil puncturing the netting. It really does nothing to their netting.
So the Boeing 707 fully loaded plane would weigh 300 tons, whereas the Twin Towers were built to sustain about 13,000 tons.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. The building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door. The jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
But the largest aircraft flying today, at least commercially, the 747, fully loaded, is on the order of 300 tons. So if you think about a 300-ton element crashing into a building that's been designed to carry 13,000 tons, you can see that an aircraft crashing into the World Trade Center would probably not do anything.
We designed the buildings to take the impact of the Boeing 707 hitting the building at any location.
But the plane had already hit. And what I noticed was the lights were still on in the lobby. That led me to believe that the plane never got to the core columns because the feeds for all these transformers feeding all the light and power in the towers were adjacent to the core columns.
Those aircraft and those fires could not cause those buildings to come down in that way.
The idea that airplanes could have destabilized the buildings never made much sense to me. The Twin Towers were like a solid iron rod coming out of the ground, supported by another steel building surrounding it.
So, a great analogy for that is if you have a stop sign, right, and you have a gun with a flaming hot bullet, even if you shot at that stop sign 5 times, the only thing the bullet's gonna do is go through that stop sign. It's not gonna just make the stop sign disintegrate and turn into dust. That's not gonna happen.
So that's going to wrap up today's video, but we still have a lot to get into. We're really only at the tip of the iceberg. So we are going to be making a part 2, so stay tuned.
Alright guys, I'm Peter.
My name's Tanner.
And this has been the Decryption Podcast. Peace out.